Sentence structure. A simple guide to building well-structured sentences in English. There are 4 basic sentence forms in English. Number 1, simple sentences, complex sentences, compound sentences, and number 4, compound complex sentences. This sounds quite scary, but actually it's very straightforward. Let's talk first of all, of course, about number 1, simple sentences. Simple sentences consist of one independent clause which contains a subject and a verb. It's that easy. This is the basic form of communication that everybody uses most of the time. Let's take a look at some examples. These are simple sentences. Karen baked cookies for dessert. It's a single clause. It holds a single idea. Jeff and John are brothers. And the question, where are you going? All of those are simple sentences. They all contain a single idea, a subject, and a verb. Let's look at number 2, compound sentences. Compound sentences are very easy as well. Compound sentences are simply 2 independent clauses, like the ones we just saw. They're joined together with a conjunction. Both of the clauses express a complete thought. So let's have a look at some examples here. Jana wants cereal, but Paul wants pancakes. There are 2 simple sentences there. Jana wants cereal, Paul wants pancakes. They are joined together using the conjunction but. Jana wants cereal, but Paul wants pancakes. 2 independent clauses, clauses that make sense on their own, joined together with a conjunction. If we look at the second one, there's 2 simple sentences there, or simple clauses. We went to the beach. We went to the mountains. Both of those are standalone clauses, but they're joined together. They could be sentences, but they're joined together with the conjunction and then. We went to the beach, and then we went to the mountains. So those are 2 independent clauses, 2 independent sentences. They hold their own idea, the beach and the mountains. They're joined together with the conjunction and then. The third one, again, 2 independent clauses. Chris was hungry. He made a sandwich. Both of those would work as standalone sentences, but they're joined together with the conjunction so. Chris was hungry, so he made a sandwich. Let's look now at number 3, complex sentences. Complex sentences require one independent clause accompanied by 1 or more dependent clauses. And we'll look at those as we go through them. The dependent clauses are underlined below. So here are the examples. Here we have a complex sentence. When it stops raining, we will play baseball. The independent clause, the independent idea, the sentence, if you like, is we will play baseball. That stands on its own. That's an independent clause. The dependent clause is when it stops raining. You can't just go up to someone and say, when it stops raining, because he will expect you to say something else about what will happen when it stops raining, which in this case is, we will play baseball. So when it stops raining is a dependent clause. It doesn't stand alone. It doesn't mean anything on its own. And we will play baseball is the independent clause. You could use that as a standalone sentence. If we look at the second one, the standalone sentence is you should brush your teeth. You could go up to someone and say, hey, you should brush your teeth. But you can't go up to them and say, before you go to bed, because they will expect you to add something to that dependent clause. So you should brush your teeth is an independent clause. Before you go to bed is a dependent clause. It doesn't make sense on its own. If we look at the third example, the independent clause is Mrs. Thomas let us read books. Presumably Mrs. Thomas is a teacher or a librarian, or she runs a bookshop. It doesn't really matter. Mrs. Thomas let us read books. The two dependent clauses are because she is nice and that we brought from home. Neither of those can be used as independent sentences. You couldn't go up to someone and say, because she is nice. You could use it as the answer to a question, but on its own, it doesn't make sense. Similarly, that we brought from home doesn't make sense. You have to describe what it is that we brought from home. So the sentence is the dependent clause, because she is nice. Mrs. Thomas let us read books. That's an independent clause. And then it's followed by another dependent clause, that we brought from home. Because she is nice, Mrs. Thomas let us read books that we brought from home. Two dependent clauses on either side of the independent clause, Mrs. Thomas let us read books. Now let's look at number 4, compound complex sentences. A compound sentence that also contains a dependent clause. Now, we looked at compound sentences just a moment ago. Jana wants cereal, but Paul wants pancakes. So that's two independent clauses joined together with a conjunction. So for compound complex, we have one of those plus a dependent clause. Let's have a look at these examples. The first example, after we arrived at school, I went to gym and Sarah went to English. So we have two independent clauses joined with a conjunction. I went to gym and Sarah went to English. But that is preceded by the dependent clause after we arrived at school. You couldn't go up to someone and say, after we arrived at school, they would be waiting to hear what happened after you arrived at school. So after we arrived at school is a dependent clause. I went to gym is an independent clause. Sarah went to English is an independent clause. They are joined together with and, the conjunction. If we look at the second example, I need a new coat. That's an independent clause. Mom said that she would buy one for me. That's an independent clause. Because my old one is worn out is a dependent clause that describes why I need a new coat. So I need a new coat because my old one is worn out. So, conjunction, Mom said she would buy one for me. So the compound sentence is I need a new coat, so Mom said she would buy one for me. And the complex part is the addition of the dependent clause because my old one is worn out. If we look at the third example, again, the opening phrase, will you bring chips for the party? That's a question, but it's also an independent clause. The finish of it is, can you invite Marie? That's the independent clause, and is the conjunction. And in the middle there, we have the dependent clause that we are having for Jan. Will you bring chips for the party? Independent clause. That we are having for Jan, dependent clause. Can you invite Marie? Independent clause with the conjunction and. Okay, that sounds a bit complex. It's actually very, very simple. This is all you have to remember. Simple sentences, one independent clause contains a subject and a verb, and it is, in fact, a complete idea. It stands alone. Compound sentences are two of those joined together with a conjunction. A complex sentence is an independent clause with one or more dependent clauses. Dependent clauses are clauses that don't make sense on their own, which need the independent clause to explain them. And then compound complex is simply number two, the compound sentences there, two simple sentences joined together with a conjunction plus a dependent clause that needs one or other of the compound sentences to explain them. Okay, now then, let's have a look at the rules that you need to remember. And again, it's actually very simple. In reality, you only need to remember rule one. Every sentence must contain at least one independent clause, which is a phrase which expresses a complete thought or idea and which contains a subject and a verb. There's an asterisk there which tells us not every sentence other than things like orders, questions, and exclamations, like stop, go, what, who. But apart from that, every sentence must contain at least one independent clause. Longer sentences can be made by adding additional clauses, either independent, clauses which make sense on their own, or dependent, meaning they require an independent clause to explain them. Complex sentences have an independent clause and one or more dependent clauses, and compound sentences are simply two standalone sentences joined together, usually with a conjunction. And then the fourth rule, compound complex sentences are just compound sentences which also contain a dependent clause. Very, very simple. These are the rules, but it's important to note that these are the rules for writing. When you're writing, if you want to write good sentences, you have to know, understand, and obey these rules. For speaking, not so much. We don't usually speak in sentences. I do when I'm delivering this kind of lesson, and we do it when we're making speeches or making presentations. But in general conversation, we speak in phrases and groups of phrases. We don't usually speak in sentences. So the same rules do not necessarily apply. So now let's look at sentence patterns. There are 7 basic sentence patterns in English. This is very debatable. In some books you'll find 5, in some you'll find 7, in some you'll find 10, in some you'll find 12, and in fact there are up to 30 basic sentence patterns which are recognized in English. But what we're actually talking about here is core clause structures. They're called sentence patterns, but we're really talking about clauses, primarily independent clauses. And here are the 7 core examples which I like to use as the most common sentence or clause patterns. There are lots of others, but most sentences fall into this kind of pattern. Most clauses fall into this kind of pattern. Sentences can be much bigger and much more complicated, but clauses are generally built up of this kind of structure. So let me explain these 7 structures which we have here. There are 5 main components that we're interested in terms of sentence patterns. S is subject, V is the verb, O is an object, C is a complement, and A is an adverbial. And then we split them up with the slash, which denotes the boundary between these terms. Now, let's have a look at this in more detail. John laughed. SV, subject, verb. John is the subject, laughed is the verb. It's very simple. So that is the most basic form of clause or sentence structure in English. John laughed, subject, verb. If we look at the second one, we have subject, verb, object. John kissed Jane. John is the subject, kissed is the verb, Jane is the object. The next form is subject, verb, and complement. A complement is something which talks about either the subject or the object. So John is tall. Tall is an adjective, and adjective is a kind of what we call a complement, something which adds information. If we look at the fourth one here, John gave Jane a present. SVOO, subject, verb, object, object. So John is the subject, gave is the verb, Jane is an object, and a present is another object. And then we have SVOC, John made Jane angry. So John is the subject, made is the verb, Jane is the object, and angry is another complement. It's another adjectival kind of description. It adds information about Jane's state. Then the second last one there, John sat up, is SVA. Subject, verb, and adverbial. As you know, an adverb is something which describes a verb, and here up describes the verb to sit. John, the subject, sat, the verb, up is the adverbial. John sat up. And then the last one is SVOA. John put the bag down. John is the subject, put is the verb, the bag is the object, and down is an adverbial that relates to the verb put. John put down the bag. John put the bag down. SVOA. Those are the 7 most common patterns. There are many others which can happen, but most clauses fall into these kinds of patterns. Now, we've seen these common. Think of them as clause patterns. They are simple sentences, absolutely, but we usually use them as clause patterns to build longer sentences. And that's the point. There are no limits. Most clauses in simple and complex use these patterns. Compound, not so much. I'll explain that in a moment. But no matter how long the clauses or sentences actually are, it really doesn't matter because they follow the same kind of structure. So if we look at the example below, Jane bought fruit is SVO, subject, verb, object. The bottom one says, my long-lost sister Jane has been buying a variety of fruit. A much longer sentence, but in fact it is exactly the same. It's SVO. The subject is my long-lost sister Jane, the verb is has been buying, and the object is a variety of fruit. Different sentences, different lengths of sentences, but they have exactly the same structure. The caveat we have there about compound is compound sentences by and large follow similar patterns, but they also include conjunctions and various other things. So they are sometimes a little bit different. But these are the 7 most common clause patterns that you will find. So let's do some sentence building. This is where you get to do some work. Take a look at the words and phrases on the right. They make up a sentence from a famous book. When you're ready, pause the video and try to work out what the sentences should be, write it down, and then press go. Compare what you wrote down to what the author wrote originally, which will appear in the next slide. So carry on, press the pause button, and see if you can work out what this sentence should be. In spite of everything, I still believe people are really good at heart. So that's what the sentence should be. Hopefully you wrote that down. It comes from a book called The Diary of Anne Frank, written by Anne Frank. In spite of everything, I still believe people are really good at heart. This is a book well worth reading, though it is quite sad. Let's try another one. Have a look at these words on the left. Press the pause button. Try and work out what the sentence should be, and then press go. This comes from a book called Jane Eyre by a writer called Charlotte Bronte. I would always rather be happy than dignified. Hopefully, that is what you managed to write down. Let's have a look at another one. Once again, look at these words here. These are much more up to date. Jane Eyre was written over 100 years ago. This is much more up to date. Press the pause button and see if you can work out what this sentence should be. In all of these, I've left the punctuation in, capitals, commas, and full stops, to help you to understand the structure that we need. So press pause, write it down, and then press go, and we'll see what it should be. This is actually a quote from one of the Harry Potter books, the first Harry Potter book. It does not do well to dwell on dreams and forget to live. Remember that. So there you go. That's an interesting quotation from Harry Potter. Did you get it right? Let's move on to another one. This is a little bit more complicated. Have a look at the words on the left, the phrases on the left. Press pause, try to work out what the sentence should be, and then press go. I don't want to fade away, I want to flame away. I want my death to be an attraction, a spectacle, a mystery. By the author, Jennifer Egan. I put that in because I thought that was an interesting and exciting quotation. Here's the last one. Try and work out what this sentence should be. Press pause and have a go. The sentence should be, the guitarist turned out to be quite good, so we decided not to eat him, which is the opening line of the book 2020 Hindsight by Jock House. So that's the last of the sentence building, but here, finally, is an interesting challenge for you. This is a quotation from So Long and Thanks for All the Fish by Douglas Adams. I'll leave it to you to read the sentence on your own. And the question is, do you think this sentence is correct? Once again, you might want to press the pause button and have a think about it. Is this sentence right? If not, what's wrong with it? Okay, to explain it, to make it clearer, let's look at the rest of the quotation. So let me read the whole thing for you. The problem is, or rather one of the problems, for there are many, a sizable proportion of which are continually clogging up the civil, commercial and criminal courts in all areas of the galaxy, and especially, where possible, the more corrupt ones, this. The previous sentence makes sense. That is not the problem. This is change. Read it through again and you'll get it. So the opening sentence, the long sentence, does make sense. But it is also deliberately a joke on things that you can do with English and English grammar, which although they make sense and are grammatically correct, are very strange to read. And that's something that Douglas Adams enjoyed doing. He enjoyed playing with language. The important thing to remember, though, here is that in English, a sentence can be as long and as complicated as you can make it, so long as it obeys the basic grammatical rules and makes sense to the reader, at least when they think about it. If you'd like to know more about Douglas Adams and this particular quote, it comes from his book, So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, which is the fourth book in the Hitchhiker's trilogy. The first book is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. All of Douglas Adams' stuff is recommended reading, though some of the words he uses are pretty unusual.